Hello and welcome to part 2 of our discussion of Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado as part of the series on Poe titled Deep into That Darkness Peering. And just as a review from our last video, the 4 particular themes or images that I've chosen to concentrate on as we look at Poe's fiction are the shadow. This is the notion of evil and darkness, the question of evil and its sources that will pervade the majority of Poe's writing. The second will be the clock. This is the terror of time and of mortality that is a creeping and constant concern for humankind. The third theme would be the mirror. This need for recognition, this need to confront the real self, or as a way of doubling, which will appear in a lot of Poe's work, this sense of seeing your own self in another person, in a double or in a doppelganger, this need we have, although we often seek to avoid it, to confront ourselves for who and what we really are. And then finally, the mask. This is our tendency to avoid that startling reality that comes in the mirror. This is the appeal of anonymity in our lives, this desire to play act socially, to wear masks in front of one another, to deceive and to flatter, to be hypocritical. And often mask wearing might be a means of avoiding our real selves by trying to pretend to be a different self, trying to circumvent the truth in favor for a more appealing or a more entertaining reality. So last time we left off here with this irony from Montresor in response to Fortunato's statement that he shall not die of a cough. That is true enough. Montresor's rather menacing agenda is coming to the surface here. For the rest of the story, we really see both Montresor and Fortunato in this way of mirroring as doubles of one another, that both of them are descending into hell together. They are both of them bearing the torchlight, both of them interested in wine, both of them moving further and further down the labyrinth into the heart of the story, into the interior. But also that labyrinth as a descent psychologically for Montresor. The Fortunato is descending to his own death, though he doesn't realize it. Montresor is likewise descending into a different kind of death, perhaps a psychological or even a spiritual death, as Fortunato by the end of the story will be immured behind this stone wall. We'll see Montresor also in the same plight, as equally trapped or equally locked in this dark and foreboding position deep in the underbelly or deep in the minds of his own psyche and of his own guilt and sinful heart. The next moment that we'll look at here comes a little bit later on in this part of the page here, where Montresor reminds Fortunato of what his family's coat of arms is. And this is one of the most revealing moments regarding Montresor's scheming and his agenda and how it might be symbolically represented. They toast to Fortunato's long life, another point of irony. This is a life whose length will only increase his suffering. The longer Fortunato lives down there, imprisoned behind the wall that Montresor erects, the worse his life will be. So it's a rather ironic toast. He again took my arm, and we proceeded. We see some more of their doubling as they go together arm in arm down into the depths of the vaults. These vaults, he said, are extensive. The Montresors, I replied, were a great and numerous family. Again, the recognition of mortality here as coming for everyone. The Montresor family was great and numerous, but as we see down in these catacombs are the remains of many of the Montresors who have gone before this Montresor. That the entirety of the human species is one of mortality and one of death. I forget your arms, Fortunato says, and here Montresor will remind him of his coat of arms, and this is a significant image. A huge human foot d'or, which just means golden, in a field azure, which means kind of blue. The foot crushes a serpent rampant, whose fangs are embedded in the heel. So let's pause here just for a moment and recognize the biblical allusion going on in reference to Genesis 3:15 in the Bible, which is often called the proto-evangelium, which just means the first gospel. And Genesis 3:15 in the Bible is often considered the first reference to the gospel in the Bible. This comes right after the fall of man. Adam and Eve have fallen in the Garden of Eden. And there is this declaration that's made, this prophecy that's made, that looks forward all the way to the crucifixion of Christ and the death of death, the death of sin and evil once and for all in that climactic moment on the cross. And Genesis 3:15 says, "And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." And this is a prophecy that God makes toward Satan in the garden, that there will be enmity, there will be strife between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed, that there will be this hostility and tension between man and evil as a result of the fall. But the gospel, the gift in Genesis 3:15, is when he says, "It shall bruise thy head," the seed of the woman. The seed of the woman will bruise thy head, the serpent's head, and thou, the serpent, shall bruise his heel. So the prophecy is that there will be a seed or an offspring of the woman that will bruise or crush the head of the serpent. And in that crushing, the heel of the seed of the woman will be bruised. And this is a reference to the coming of Christ, the second Adam, who comes to crush the head of the serpent once and for all, to conquer sin and death, and in so doing, his heel will be bruised. That the seed of the woman, Jesus, the offspring that is foretold, will have his heel bruised in the moment of conquering, and that's in the death of Christ, that he is bruised for a time, but it is his heel, whereas the head of the serpent will be crushed forever, and the enmity between man and evil will be resolved once and for all. So notice back here this image of the foot crushing the serpent in Montresor's coat of arms. This is an interesting symbol where there is this vindication or the sense of conquering that is connected to the biblical allusion. And yet here, the foot doing the crushing is not the Messiah's foot. It's not the prophecy in Genesis, but rather Montresor's foot crushing the 1,000 injuries of Fortunato that was referenced in the opening line. So here we have this perversion of the gospel where it has been mutated into an arrogant, man-centered prediction rather than the proto-evangelium, the first offering of the good news of the gospel that we get in Genesis, that the foot crushing the serpent in this context is Montresor's interest in crushing Fortunato for good for the 1,000 injuries that he has borne. And likewise, we don't get this image like we do in Genesis of the heel being bruised in the crushing of the serpent, but rather the foot crushing the serpent has fangs embedded in the heel, which this looks more like an irony here, that both of the figures, the human foot, the huge human foot, you see Montresor's sense of pride here, this huge golden foot backlit by a blue field. This foot crushes the serpent, but the serpent's fangs are embedded in the heel. Where here, both figures, the foot and the serpent, are locked and joined together in this eternally fruitless and hopeless death embrace, where there is not a decisive victory of one over the other. The foot crushes the serpent, and the serpent's fangs embed in the heel, poisoning and paralyzing the foot. So rather than what the account we get in Scripture of this human foot crushing the head and merely being bruised in the doing, we get rather this eternal sense of death between Fortunato and Montresor, that the actions of the one against the other will be met with returned actions. That Montresor's destruction of Fortunato will not be a clean and pure vindication, but it is a judgment, it is an act of violence and an act of murder that will be met in turn by the guilt and sorrow that will last, as we find out at the end of the story, for 50 years. Montresor is still suffering with the poison of guilt that has been embedded in his heel by his killing of Fortunato. And the motto that goes with it is quite revealing as well. Nemo me impune lacessit. No one attacks me or insults me or cuts me, literally, with impunity. This stretches back to the beginning of the story, where Montresor is talking about the injuries that Fortunato has delivered to him, that they will be returned with punishment. That no one attacks me with impunity. Nobody injures me or insults me without being punished. So this puts Montresor almost in this state of being a divine agent of justice or of retribution, which is difficult territory for a human to be in. That rather than leave vengeance to the Lord, as Scripture says, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay, Montresor seems to be putting that mantle on his own shoulders and seeking revenge and justice for these ambiguous wrongs that he's claiming himself, that he is operating as this agent of justice by delivering back to those who have wronged him a punishment that is fitting, that he is the foot that will crush. But the irony is here that in the crushing, he too will be, in a way, crushed. That the poison of guilt and that suffering will also paralyze Montresor just as much as the walling up of the stones in the catacombs will destroy Fortunato. The wine sparkled in his eyes, and the bells jingled. My own fancy grew warm with the Medoc, that there's this doubling here where both of them are being linked in this intoxication. We had passed through walls of piled bones, with casks and puncheons intermingling into the inmost recesses of the catacombs. So this descent into the shadow, and again, the shadow is one of our themes. This descent into hell, into the very heart of darkness itself, is one that they are taking together. That they are both passing through the walls, intermingling casks and puncheons down into the inmost recesses of the catacombs. We move ahead. There's a mention here of the Masons, the sense of the brotherhood that Fortunato asks if Montresor is a part of. Montresor rather comically brings out his trowel to show Fortunato that he is one of the Masons, and Fortunato accuses him of jesting. But this will, of course, serve as foreshadowing for how Montresor will use the trowel at the end of the story. That what Fortunato believes is a sign of their brotherhood, of their community, is actually a sign that will detach Montresor from Fortunato. This is an instrument that Montresor will use to disconnect himself from Fortunato. So there's this very interesting irony here that Poe is drawing between that which ought to signify us as one, that which ought to bring us together, can often be perverted or utilized in such a way as to tear us apart. And this is where the violence at the end of the story matters immensely. The way in which Montresor kills Fortunato is symbolic and revealing of the walls that are constructed between us as a perversion of, or a destruction of, the way that humans ought to be doubled, or the way that humans ought to be brought together, which is through our brotherhood and through our community. Poe goes on to describe their descent. It was in vain that Fortunato, uplifting his dull torch, endeavored to pry into the depth of the recess. Its termination, the feeble light, did not enable us to see. Proceed, I said. Herein is the Amontillado. He again appeals to Fortunato's pride by referencing this other figure, Lucchese, who may be better suited to verify the Amontillado. Fortunato is insulted by this. He's an ignoramus, interrupted my friend as he stepped unsteadily forward, while I followed immediately at his heels. Now, this is another interesting twist here, because the fangs embedded in the heel of the coat of arms earlier are those of Fortunato, where Montresor is the huge human foot doing the crushing. But now it is Montresor who is following close at hand, ready to strike at Fortunato's heels, ready to destroy him. So the ambiguity of that symbol, with the foot crushing and the serpent's fangs embedding themselves, equally applying to both Montresor and Fortunato, shows how both of them are united in this doom, in this sense of damnation, that neither one of them is more justified in his actions. Neither of them is above reproach in this story, that both of them are descending together into the heart of hell. Which brings us to the conclusion of the story. And this is a key passage here. This is when Montresor starts constructing the wall, immuring Fortunato into the niche, where he will be imprisoned and trapped. Notice too that his drunkenness keeps him from being alert enough to know what is going on. And here Poe describes this moment of hesitation and of fear in Montresor. And this is where the complexities of Montresor's character will start to reveal themselves. That Montresor can't be viewed as a simply flat character. That there seems to be much more going on beneath the surface in him as he is committing this murder against Fortunato. A succession of loud and shrill screams bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form seemed to thrust me violently back. So now there is an impact on Montresor here, that perhaps he is not completely in control of the situation, but rather the events of the murder are having an effect on him, not just on Fortunato. For a brief moment, I hesitated. I trembled. Notice this. Unsheathing my rapier, I began to grope with it about the recess, but the thought of an instant reassured me. I placed my hand upon the solid fabric of the catacombs and felt satisfied. I re-approached the wall. I replied to the yells of him who clamored. I re-echoed. I aided. I surpassed them in volume and in strength. I did this, and the clamorer grew still. Now notice here this reference of the chained form. Now at first we think this is Fortunato, of course, that he is literally chained to the wall. Montresor has done this, and Montresor is beginning to construct the wall. But the chained form also might imply psychologically and spiritually to Montresor, that in telling this story we discover that Montresor himself seems unable to escape the confines of the catacombs. Although he is not literally there for the 50 years that have passed between this moment and his telling of it, it seems that he is still trapped by the story that he wishes to tell. He is paralyzed by the weight of what he has done. He cannot forget it. Someone once said that in Montresor's mind, he is still down there in the hole with Fortunato, that he is himself a chained form in many ways by the psychological and the spiritual effects of his murder. The guilt and the suffering that he has endured for 50 years in holding this secret inside him and holding this story inside him, that he too is chained. He seems to be thrust back by these loud and shrill screams, and the key moment especially is the hesitation and the trembling. This seems to reveal that Montresor has some sort of moral compass within him, that he's not completely devoid of conscience and of morality here, that perhaps for a brief moment, Montresor is recognizing the weight of what he's doing, that in effect, this is the sense of the mirror. Perhaps Montresor is able to see, at least for a moment, that he is no different from this chained form, and that perhaps what he is about to accomplish will do far worse to him than it would do to Fortunato. That certainly Fortunato will die, but perhaps it is worse for Montresor in suffering a living death, this living sense of guilt that will weigh on him. He begins to grope about with his rapier. The thought of an instant, though, reassures him of his task, and he feels satisfied. Now look at this doubling here. This goes back again to this notion of a mirror, that perhaps in seeing and hearing Fortunato's anguish, Montresor is brought to recognize and tremble at his own. But then as he goes forward, I reapproached the wall, I replied to the yells, I re-echoed. This three-part series of the prefix re, where he reapproaches the wall, he returns to it, he replies to the yells, and he re-echoes them, and most importantly, surpasses them in volume and in strength. I did this and the clamorer grew still. It's interesting to note that Montresor is replying to Fortunato's screams with surpassing screams of his own. The loud and shrill screams he hears, rather than allow them to force him to stop his project, to repent, and to save Fortunato, and in effect save his own conscience, rather Montresor returns, replies, and re-echoes with greater screams, indicating that rather than confronting his own sin and repenting of it, he sees himself in the double and descends further into the darkness and the evil of his action, that he is in effect going further and further into the recesses of the shadow, the darkness of his actions, by surpassing the screams of Fortunato here. It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. Notice that Montresor has one remaining opportunity to back down from his project here of destroying Fortunato and of destroying himself. Remember, Fortunato and Montresor are linked. Remember the coat of arms. The heel and the fangs are intertwined together in this endless cycle of fruitlessness, this endless cycle of hostility and revenge and injury. And so unless Montresor can break that cycle through possibly forgiving Fortunato of these 1,000 injuries, abandoning his quest in murdering Fortunato, unless he's able to do that, locking Fortunato into this prison will in effect lock him into his own prison. What happens to Fortunato will happen to Montresor. They are doubles. They are linked characters. So he has a single stone remaining, and he struggles with its weight. Now this might be a literal struggle, of course, but it's interesting Poe doesn't describe this behavior to any of the other stones. In fact, the walling up of the stones seems like a rather effortless occasion up to this point, and yet Poe takes a moment to say this last stone, Montresor struggles with the weight of it, perhaps even indicating the weight of a guilty conscience that Montresor is struggling with at the time and continues to struggle with ever since. I placed it partially in its destined position. But now there came from out the niche a low laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. This goes back to the trembling earlier. Montresor is being given moments of recognition. He's given moments in which he can encounter the truth of what he's doing and perhaps turn back before it's too late. It was succeeded by a sad voice, which I had difficulty in recognizing as that of the noble Fortunato. The voice said, "Ha ha ha, he he, a very good joke indeed, an excellent jest. We will have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo, he he he, over our wine, he he he. The Amontillado, I said. He he he, he he he, yes, the Amontillado. Look how Poe will continue to use repetition to emphasize the doubling going on, the sense of the mirroring. But is it not getting late? Will not they be awaiting us at the palazzo, the Lady Fortunato and the rest? Let us be gone. Notice this sense of identity, how they are linked together. And notice the repetition. Yes, I said, let us be gone. For the love of God, Montresor. Yes, I said, for the love of God. Now again, notice the doubling of the repetition and the echo. Let us be gone, let us be gone. For the love of God, for the love of God. Now in this line, this is a quite interesting line. Perhaps Montresor feels that he is exacting the will of God here on the prideful Fortunato. Some scholars have written about how there might be some literal religious tension between Montresor and Fortunato, given that Montresor may be Catholic and Fortunato a Mason. Certainly, this notion of Montresor doing what he is doing for the love of God may harken back to this sense of Montresor as a divine agent of justice and retribution. This is a theme that Poe will certainly explore in one of my favorite stories of his that we'll look at in the series later on, called Hop Frog. This notion of humans being capable of exacting the will of God. Are humans capable of or permitted to enforce the justice of God? Which was an interesting consideration, whether vengeance and retribution can be in the hands of the vigilante. Does it rely on the minds and hearts and courage of good men to enforce the will of God, or shall we just allow for God to enact justice on his own? What place is there for justice and the judicial system in human society when humans are all flawed? That perhaps there's much to explore there about how Montresor sees himself in this action. But to these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. This is the moment where the repetition dwindles here. I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called out, Fortunato! And now there is no answer. Fortunato, no answer still. So something has happened here in Fortunato that will have an effect on Montresor, that the repetition and the doubling seems to be winding down here, that we are left with Montresor in his internal state rather than seeing his internal state in Fortunato. I thrust a torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came forth in reply only a jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick. Now here's another revealing line from Montresor, which it reminds me of the line in Hamlet, how one of the guards in Act 1 says, "'Tis bitter cold and I'm sick at heart." How the internal state of man is often impacted by external circumstances and actions. That Montresor's heart growing sick may be a result of this action, this single stone being fitted into its place, this unrepentant murder of Fortunato, though he simply dismisses it as the dampness of the catacombs. And that may account for a physical sickness, the dampness of the catacombs, the darkness, and so on. But his heart growing sick, I think we've seen so far ample evidence showing that Montresor's spiritual state and his psychological state is eternally damaged by this action that he can't undo. I hastened to make an end of my labor. Notice his rushing here. That it's only at this point we see Montresor moving from a methodical and calculated approach to a rather trembling and quickened approach, where he's hastening to make an end of it. That seems to indicate a slight change in his circumstances here, where perhaps now his guilt and his anguish is much more finely tuned than it perhaps was earlier. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up. Against the new masonry, I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed them. 50 years have passed since this action, and Montresor still seems chained to these events, chained to this story, and even now perhaps feeling compelled to confess, at least to the reader. This final statement in Pace Requiescat translates to, "May he rest in peace," which is interesting here. Who is the he of the phrase? Is this a burial, and he is simply wishing that Fortunato rest in peace? Or is this a confession? Interestingly, this phrase is used both in the Requiem Mass and during last rites. So is this a statement of peace that Montresor is wishing for his own soul in confessing his story to us? Or is this a statement being said over the death and the internment of Fortunato? Or is this the reader? Are we being encouraged to rest in peace after having identified ourselves, perhaps through Montresor and his narration? Perhaps we see ourselves here as a mirror to Montresor, and we are being encouraged and prompted to rest in peace, to confess our own sins, once we have recognized and mirrored ourselves with Montresor here by seeing the story through his eyes. 50 years later, in Montresor, perhaps even on his deathbed, imagine how old he was when he accomplished this deed, and now 50 years later is compelled to confess it to us. On his deathbed, perhaps, who is it that needs to rest in peace? And maybe even the possibility of resting in peace being introduced. Is it possible for one to rest in peace after having committed this action of murder with an unrepentant heart? So, thank you for following along with this reading of the Cask of Amontillado. Stay tuned for our next story in this series, Deep into That Darkness Peering, as we look at Poe's fiction together.